Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 6. This week, I want to talk a little bit about state and city relationships. And once again, as I always state at the beginning of these lectures, the lecture actually is designed for me to bring out a few points, not designed to take the place of the reading. So please do the reading. Let me get right into the lecture and let's see what we're talking about here. Okay, just actually, I wanted to throw in a couple of course reminders, being that this is week 6, meaning we're about halfway through the course. August is coming up, unbelievably. It's almost the end of June. So for this week, week 6, there's no discussion board. There is a journal that's going to be due this week, and it's going to be specific actually to this particular topic, but I'll get to that at the end of the presentation today. The next 2 weeks after this week, that means weeks 7 and 8. If you read ahead, you notice that what I'm going to focus on is a few chapters from the book Collaborating to Manage by Bob Agranoff. I think this is kind of important because what this book talks about is the idea of collaboration between entities. Between nonprofits and governmental, but also between governmental entities. And I think one of the big things that is occurring really already, as Agranoff discusses, and is going to continue to occur, is this idea that governmental organizations and governmental entities must collaborate to manage, especially given the way that cities, towns, counties organize. And so I wanted to purposely take this diversion of a couple of weeks just to talk about this idea of collaboration. And we're going to have a couple of weeks of discussion boards to talk about collaboration in general. Then right after that, weeks 9 through 11, we're going to go into what I call the specialty weeks. So, the units on healthcare, the units on emergency management, et cetera, local government. And those are the weeks where you will be able to pick your track for 3 weeks. And we'll talk about intergovernmental management, intergovernmental relations issues with regard to those specialty policy areas, if you will. We'll come back together for week 12, where I'll ask you to post your learning summary. And then your final essay, which is, as you recall from reading the syllabus, the future of, and then in parentheses, some intergovernmental area. You should be thinking about that by now. The specialty tracks really, I think, should help you as you develop that essay. And again, go back and read the syllabus. That's not a full-blown research paper. It is an essay. And so go back and read the syllabus if you haven't looked at it in a couple of weeks for the requirements of that. But again, I'd like you to be thinking about that as it will be due during the very last part of the course. Okay, let's move right into this week. Okay, so the Dillon rule versus home rule. And if you read the article by Richardson, what he asserts, what he says is that these terms really aren't opposites, though they might be used popularly as opposites. You're a Dillon rule state, you're a home rule state. What he says is really, it shouldn't be used in that term. The Dillon rule is a statutory construction, as he calls it. It's a way of interpreting statute. Dillon himself, this judge in Iowa in 1865 or so, he didn't create the rule. He really was commenting on existing jurisprudence, which had previously ruled that this rule, that is that the cities and towns are creatures of the state, really already applied. And then later in this article, Richardson notes that the Supreme Court later in the early 1900s actually held up Dillon's rule as really the constitutional way to look at the relationship between cities and states. But home rule varies, and this is the point Richardson makes. Home rule is simply not just one thing. There's several categories of home rule, and he says it's kind of confusing, right? So if you read the article, that's what he's getting at. But in general, a home rule might prevent a state from delegating too much authority, and thus the cost, really, of policy to cities. In other words, a home rule might prevent the state from, saying that the city is in charge of highways, for example. In general, it provides cities the ability to manage what are deemed as local affairs without interference. Home rule might provide freedom from certain state statutes or freedom to engage in certain legislative or operational activities. In Nebraska, this is from the Constitution. It's actually Article 11 in the Nebraska Constitution. This is a quote from a court case in 1939 that said, "The purpose of home rule charter provisions of the Constitution is to render cities as nearly independent as possible of state legislation, subject to the general public policy of the state." So in Nebraska, actually, and some of you know this, there's really only two charter cities, home rule charter cities in Nebraska. That is Lincoln and Omaha. There's actually two different clauses in Article 11 of the Constitution. One concerns cities of 5,000 or more persons. One concerns cities of 100,000 or more persons, which Omaha and Lincoln, in our somewhat sparsely populated state, are the only two cities in that category. So Omaha has a home rule charter and Lincoln has a home rule charter. There have been issues that have come up with regard to the home rule charter. As it turns out, and this is one of the issues that are talked about in a couple of the articles, Omaha has the only anti-discrimination ordinance in the state regarding LGBTQ persons. Lincoln has considered passing such an ordinance. It has not done so as of yet. The state attorney general at the time when Omaha was considering passing its anti-discrimination ordinance, which was in 2012, said that even under home rule, that ordinance might be unconstitutional and illegal. Omaha passed it anyway. The state attorney general did not sue Omaha. So it really wasn't unconstitutional, evidently. But so that's the Nebraska wording on home rule. So one of the things I gleaned from the three articles, the article by Robert Blair and Anthony Stark, the short article by Richard Florida, and the other article by Newell, is some questions that pop up in my mind. And that is that there's this urban-rural divide, or city-state divide, we might call it. And so I wanted to ask a few questions about this city-state divide and ask, is it historical? Is it real? Is it institutional? And are urban and rural problems different? Now, on this slide, I'm calling these urban and rural problems. I actually kind of have a Nebraska bias, because what gets talked about in Nebraska, if you follow the state legislature, the unicameral, when it meets every spring, either in its long session or its short session, what gets talked about a lot is an urban-rural divide. And this year, 2018, this got talked about an awful lot by legislators, by the media, by the governor, especially in regard to property taxes, because what's been happening over the past few years is that the property value of agricultural land has appreciated at a rate really faster than other land values. And so what has been the implication of this? Well, the implication is that farmers are paying more property tax, because if your land appreciates very quickly, you're going to pay more property tax. And property tax relief and an argument over property tax relief has really consumed the legislature in Nebraska at least in 2018, and it will continue to do so. So I think I reveal my bias talking about urban-rural divide. The authors are talking about a state legislator, city councilor, if you will, divide. But let's move on with that. So historically speaking, the United States, we talked about the founding of the Republic when the Constitution was written in 1787 and ratified in 1788. Historically speaking, our nation really was a rural nation. In 1790, the very first census, which the Constitution mandated, an every 10-year census, the very first census, it was found that 94.9, almost 95% of the population was rural. The definition of urban, by the way, was places over 2,500 people. That number still has some import even today, but incorporated areas of over 2,500, that was a city. So only 5.1% of the population lived in cities in 1790. So you can see the percent urban to rural reverses itself later on, but it wasn't until the 1900s that the population of urban areas actually overtook the population of rural areas. So in 1860, the year Lincoln was elected right before the Civil War, about 80% of the population was in rural areas. In 1910, it was roughly half and half. So 54% in rural areas, 46% almost in urban areas. So roughly half and half. But if you've taken the 80-50 course, and they talk about the progressive era in the 80-50 course that you might have taken, you remember that one of the real important aspects of the progressive era was this idea that a lot of immigrants were settling in cities, and the cities really were ill-equipped to handle this influx of population. And so Jane Addams and others, Jane Addams, who started the settlement house movement, one of her real missions was providing relief to these populations that were basically living in squalor in cities. And you also know that the city manager movement really also had its genesis in the progressive era, when the so-called bureau men, if you read Settlement Women and Bureau Men, the so-called bureau men said that government in urban areas and cities was really inadequate because it wasn't businesslike, it wasn't professional. And this is when the idea that a city manager form of government in cities would be much more efficient. And so we know that post World War II was when the urban population overtook rural population. And so there have been a lot of things that have influenced this, obviously, right? Farms have consolidated and become much larger in terms of acreage. Farming itself has become less manpower intensive. And so you require less people to actually operate a farm or a ranch as a business. And so therefore that has downstream effects, such as the reduction in the size of small towns that support the farming sector. And so by 2010, by the most recent census, less than 20% of our population is rural and 80% of our population is urban. And so what that means is that 80% of our population in the United States lives in areas that at least 2,500 people are clustered into one area. And in 1950, the word incorporated was removed from that census counting regulation. And so many people, a lot of people live in unincorporated areas of 2,500 or more, because there are many unincorporated cities, especially in suburbs in the United States. But that means that at least 80% of people live in urban settings. And so I thought it'd be kind of cool to look at a couple of visualizations from the US Census. So this slide and the next slide provide some of these visualizations. So here's what I want you to do. You're not going to be able to do this from the YouTube version of this presentation. So what you'll have to do is open up another window on your computer of the no narration version, the PowerPoint version of this presentation, and look down there at the link on this slide and the next slide. So you see on this slide, it's that census.gov link. Click on that link. You're going to get a visualization that looks a little bit like that image I have down there in the lower right. It's going to be a map of population change by decade from 1910 to 2010. So once you do that, this visualization, if you go down a little bit on the lower right of the screen that will open from the census, it will take you through these maps. So here's what I want you to notice on this particular visualization. The population density on these maps is greater in the areas with the darker green. So when you see the darker green, that means a denser population. So you can already see, actually even just looking at this thumbnail, that you can see the Los Angeles area there in the southwest, right? And you can see it actually spreading to the Phoenix area and the Las Vegas area in the southwest. So you know that the southwest area has grown much denser in population. Everybody knows that, right? So what I also want you to notice is the relative hollowing out of the rural areas. So a great example of this is the Great Plains. You don't all live in the Great Plains. Most of you do. So I mean, look from North Dakota down through Oklahoma, and look basically at how that shade of green is changing to white, meaning that the traditional rural areas are actually growing less dense in population over this 100-year time span. You also should note the relative movement of the population centers to the south and southwest, and you will note that the density of the Los Angeles, really the southern 2/3 of California, and the Phoenix and Tucson area and the Las Vegas area have become more dense. And then along with that, the Pacific Northwest, the growth in density in the Portland and Seattle areas, for example. And then note the clustering of population around urban centers. So when you get to that 2010 map, look at those clusters of green, of dark green, and look where they're at. It doesn't actually identify them on the maps. But it's not just Los Angeles and Phoenix, as I talked about, but it's not just New York and Chicago, which of course you'd expect, but it's, clusters like Atlanta, Tampa to Orlando to Miami, Minneapolis, St. Paul, many others. So you can actually look at the map, and if you just remember a little bit of geography, you can actually start looking at the cities that have large clusters of population density. So that's the first visualization. And so then by this time, you should be opening up that visualization and looking through that. And then I will move on to the second visualization because you've already paused to do that. And we'll talk about that one. Okay, so you looked at that first visualization. Now this one, same thing, you'll have to link on it, not from the PowerPoint version, but from the PowerPoint version, not from the video version, of this map. This map is going to show you by county, metro and micro areas in 2016 from the census. So what's a metro area? A metro area in the United States, according to the census, is a core urban area of 50,000 or more persons. A micro area is a core urban area of at least 10,000 but less than 50,000. So when you get to this map, there's a couple colors I want you to key on. There's a dark gray, kind of a battleship gray color, There's a light green color, which is, I call it swimming pool green. I don't know what you call it, but I call it swimming pool green. And there's kind of a yellowish tan color in the middle. So the areas where there's a lot of people living in metro and micro areas are in the green. The areas where there's people who don't live in metro and micro areas are in that dark gray, and the kind of yellow colors in the middle. Okay, so this map is by county. So that's what makes it interesting. There's about 3,000 counties in the United States. And so this map kind of shows the same thing, but that last series of maps showed, but it does it in this county-wise way. So here's some things that you can look at. The green areas with significant portion of the population in urban areas. So really, for example, nearly the entire state of Florida, except for some areas in the Panhandle, live in micro or metro areas. Really, almost the entire state of Florida. Significant large parts of western North Carolina and South Carolina. One I picked out, because I live in Omaha, and it's close to me, is Manhattan, Kansas, basically, to Kansas City, Missouri. Most of the people live in metro or micro areas. You can actually drill down further and start looking at this map, because it is county by county, and you can start picking out counties. So in Nebraska, you can trace the counties around Omaha and Lincoln. You can trace Douglas County, Sarpy County, Cass, Lancaster County, Washington County, the counties that are around Omaha and Lincoln. You can see Minneapolis and St. Paul and the several, I think it's like 13 counties around there. So the takeaway from that is that even in the less populated states, even Alaska, there is at least one metro cluster. And that metro cluster in Alaska, really, it happens in Anchorage. But in each state, there's at least one metro cluster. And in several states, there's really only one real major metro cluster, one or two major metro clusters, and then everybody else lives in a much less densely populated area. Now we're starting to get to some of the implications of this. Okay, so who cares? I mean, is this really a problem? So Richard Florida and Lori Riverston Newell, in their articles, they suggest that cities are more, quote, progressive than rural areas. So is that really factual? I should say as a caveat, I wasn't designing this week to be overtly political. That's not my intent at all. I do have political views, obviously, but my political views are not that germane to anything that we're talking about here. But the question is, because people claim this, are urban areas more overtly progressive than rural areas? And are states, through preemption and preemption of home rule, if you will, are states actually limiting the choices of the people who live in cities, as Florida maintains? Okay, so this is an NPR article, and you can click on that link. So in this article, NPR consolidated a bunch of information, and they looked at 2016 presidential voting patterns, and they looked at what they called urban, suburban, and rural areas. And so according to this article, the blue is Democrats and the red is Republican. Okay, if you wanted to use Hillary Clinton as a proxy for progressive, and if you wanted to use Donald Trump as a progressive or as a proxy for conservative, and then look at voting, then we can ask the question, is this really a problem? Now, actually, some political scientists and other pundits might say that you can't use Hillary Clinton as a proxy for progressive and you can't use Donald Trump as a proxy for conservative, but be that as it may, I'm going to just as an assumption. So what you see here is that in urban areas voted more Democratic in the 2008, 2012, and even the 2016 elections as a block. Suburban areas were really about evenly split in the 2008 election, a little more conservative in the 2012 and 2016 elections. And then the rural areas, though, showed a big change. In the 2008 election, they were nearly evenly split between blue and red. But then you see by the 2016 election, the Republican candidate for president, Donald Trump, really carried rural areas by a large margin, more than 60%. So if we just use those things as a proxy, then we could say that, yeah, looks like rural areas might be more conservative. But again, it might be problematic using those two candidates as proxies for, respectively progressives and conservatives. So those definitions change, but I thought this was an interesting look. You might want to look at that article. It has a lot of interesting things to say about voting patterns. So the rhetorical questions for consideration, I'm not going to answer these really, but they're things to think about in regard as you read these articles. So are urban problems different than rural problems? Demographically, do people choose to reside in urban versus rural areas or any areas versus other areas? That's the Thibault hypothesis that he wrote in 1956. He said basically people have a choice, and in public choice, people choose to reside in a community based on things like tax structure, the political climate, schools, and other things. Is the Thibault hypothesis completely true? And then, are all urban areas the same? So in the Florida article, you sort of get the strong impression that Richard Florida is saying, yeah, urban people are all progressive, rural people aren't. Okay, well, is residing in Papillion, Nebraska equivalent to residing somewhere in Omaha, Nebraska, for example? They're really close. Is it the same? Is residing in Orange County, California equivalent to residing in Los Angeles County, California? Both big urban areas. Orange County, California is a very big urban area, especially by Midwest standards. But, is that the same as residing in Los Angeles County, California? I don't know. Does the nationalization of the policy agenda affect urban versus rural areas more? I think this is a really germane question. And this might be what these articles are getting at. As we nationalize the policy agenda, something we talked about the week prior, does that affect the way people view things within the context of where they're living? And do state lawmakers, city councilors, and school board members all respectively worry about different things? And does this affect the kinds of policies they advocate? So let me kind of ask a few more questions, sort of rhetorical questions on that last point. Do state and local policymakers have different worries, right? So if we assume that we elect people to deal with policy issues that we're all worried about to greater or lesser extents, do people that run for office at different levels have different worries? And just the fact that they're in office at those different levels, does that change the scope of their worries, if you will? So healthcare, do state lawmakers have a different view on healthcare than policymakers at the city level? Do state lawmakers have different issues than policymakers at the local level on education? And I think on that one, you could possibly assert that state lawmakers worry about equalizing funding between districts at the state level, or to at least the maximum extent possible, somehow trying to equalize funding between districts. Whereas city, or maybe not even city councilors, but education board members might actually worry about optimizing the funding for their district really relative to other districts, right? So this has been the criticism of property tax as a supporting mechanism for education, right? Historically, that has been the criticism of property tax because rich districts with high value properties in them get more in property tax than urban areas, in particular with lower value properties. So do those policymakers have different interests? Tax structure. We talked about tax structure a little bit in preceding weeks, right? So do city council members worry about different kinds of revenue than state lawmakers? I would assert they probably do. In Nebraska, we have had this argument about property tax valuation, and the state legislature has been struggling with what they call property tax relief, which in actuality really means that the state is trying to devise formulas to give people refunds or rebates on their property tax that local governments are charging them, because they're not really saying that local governments can't use property tax in this case. They're talking about relieving the relative tax burden through some other mechanism. Because the state, in Nebraska's case, the state doesn't collect property tax. Only localities collect property tax. The state revenue for state purposes comes from income tax and sales tax. And so, policymakers at different levels, do they have different worries about taxation? I would assert they probably do. But what about some of these other issues that were talked about in a couple of these articles, like gun control, like immigration, like minimum wage? Are there different worries about those kinds of things? And if there are, why would that be? You could assert, and it's been said, you could assert that local politicians, local elected leaders might have different views on gun control. An example, in the state of Nebraska, as a matter of fact, carrying firearms on the campuses of the University of Nebraska is not legal. You can't, unless you're a sworn police officer, you can't have a firearm on the campus of the University of Nebraska, any of the campuses. You actually can have sport rifles locked up, registered and locked up. So some shooting teams have those kinds of things, but you can't carry them around. Okay, so whether or not you think that's a good law, the point of fact is that actually is something like a local ordinance that is stronger than the state ordinance regarding firearms in the state of Nebraska. So that is the point. Do the policy views that policymakers have depend on the level of government at which they happen to be sitting? And so that kind of begs the question that Florida and Riverstone Newell, they seem to assert that policymakers in cities are more, quote, progressive than their state counterparts. So is that true? That's kind of a rhetorical question. And do local leaders seem to show more leadership in policy areas, as in the Bob Blair and Anthony Stark article? Do they actually show more leadership in these areas? I thought that was an interesting article through that assertion as well. So finally, is all of this institutional? So we spent a lot of time talking about the Constitution. Were the founders unable to foresee the rise of cities? Think back on that population table I showed you. Were the founders unable, in our country of 3 million people in 1790, were the founders unable to foresee the rise of cities? The home rule movement itself began in the mid 1800s, mostly because settlement in cities was starting to take shape. And so people in cities started to regard themselves, leaders in cities started to regard themselves as kind of a constitutional entity, even though it's not in the Constitution. Does the clear constitutional bias towards the importance of the state, and we read about some of that in the Federalist Papers in 45 and 46, does that inhibit logical growth of cities, or has it inhibited logical growth of cities? And are regions, including multi-state regions, supplanting states in importance? So, you know, I live in the Omaha Council Bluffs metro. There are much larger metros that cross state lines all over the United States. But are these regions supplanting states in importance? And then that begs just a larger question that I asked a couple of you in the couple discussions ago, and that is really the constitutional arrangement outmoded? Now that's a super rhetorical question, because I don't expect that any time in the next few years someone's going to suggest that we rearrange our political boundaries in the United States. I don't think that's going to happen, but it's an interesting question to think about, whether the constitutional arrangement is outmoded. So kind of given all that as background, and given the readings as background, here's what I'd like you to tackle for the journal assignment. I'm going to give you a little bit of homework here, a little bit of research homework. So for this journal, I'd like you to locate a valid journalistic article. I say that because I don't want people using conspiracy theory websites, but a valid journalistic article dealing with an area of conflict between a city in the United States and its parent state during the past 3 years. I'd like you to describe the conflict and then comment on how the conflict was resolved or not resolved, because it might be ongoing, on the basis of Dillon's rule, some aspect of home rule, or some other legal or mediated basis. So did they just resolve their differences by mediation or agreement somehow? And then what are the policy implications that are suggested by this conflict? So I want you to use this journal really to take some time and investigate, based on the articles, some conflict that you can find, and it might be in your own state, between cities and the state, and they're out there. I have every confidence that you'll be able to find one. So really that's it for the week. For this lecture, please do the readings, and I look forward to your journals. Thank you.